I am really thrilled to have Janelle Johnson here with us. This is Janelle Johnson's third time presenting at our conference, actually. She has not only presented, she's had a table here over the years, a very close colleague of ours, and a really great expert in dementia care. Janelle Johnson is a dementia care specialist who's been working in the field of aging services since 1989. Her career is focused primarily on the care of those with Alzheimer's and other dementias. She has a law degree from the University of Minnesota and a bachelor's degree in social work from the College of St. Catherine, which combined with her experience in this field make her an outstanding advocate for advancing best practices in Alzheimer's care. Janelle was instrumental in the development of the program at Prelude Memory Care Cottages in Woodbury here in Minnesota. And Janelle currently works as a trainer, caregiver coach, and program consultant in the field of dementia care. So everyone, please join me in warmly welcoming Janelle Johnson.
Thank you, Joe. It's a privilege to be here and an honor. I love this conference and just find it to be such a valuable tool and just some wonderful speakers, right? It's been really good. So I also, in addition to doing the trainings that I do now, I also work in hospice. I've been working in hospice for the past several years as a social worker in addition to my dementia training. And so it's interesting, I found our last speaker's topic to be very much tied into, I believe, the hard conversations, right? And as I thought about this topic of hard conversations, I really did think to myself, it could mean so many different things because there's so many different aspects of the conversations and difficulty with conversations with our loved one versus difficulty with conversations with family members. There's lots of ways that it could happen and lots of topics, lots of situations and different stages of memory loss. There's so many different things that this could mean. So I'm going to try and focus on really looking at expectations and how our expectations can influence our communication and conversation, as well as why those realistic expectations might happen, and also talk about some strategies for good communication, including what I call 8 ways to relate. So first of all, I just want to talk about why it matters. When we talk about expectations, why do our expectations matter when it comes to having those conversations? And it's really about when we have realistic expectations, when we know what to expect, it helps us to do several things. It helps us to plan for the future. It can help us to reduce anxiety, both for the person that we're caring for as well as for ourselves. It can also give us patience, again, for ourselves and for them. It can help us to help them preserve their abilities when we have realistic expectations, and it can give us perseverance when times are difficult, because we know that there are difficult times. As family members, I think there are lots of different areas that we can think about in our expectations when it comes to the communication that we need to have for those difficult and day-to-day conversations. And some of those expectations are based around personal familial relationships. So if you are, we all have family dynamics, right? And we all have our place in the family. I'm the youngest child. I will always be the youngest child to my mother. So when I was introduced as an expert in the field of dementia care and aging, but if my mother has a question, who do you think she's going to go to? It's not me. I'm the baby. I take the trash out and set up her medications. If she has a question about insurance or something else, I have older sisters who take care of that. Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't. But all that to say, those roles create expectations. If our loved one that we're caring for is the matriarch of our family, who has been the one that has always put together every social gathering that we've ever had, they and the rest of the family have expectations about that person when it comes to the family reunion or the holiday celebration that we're going to have. And those can create some problems if that person's abilities are declining. Also, that's true not only with the cognitive abilities, but with their physical abilities. I will never forget the time when I realized my own father's ability to help me with things. I had been a single mom for a long time, and my dad helped me with a lot of things. And he was in his early 70s one time when I had recently purchased a house, and I needed help with a little shed, a little shed that I wanted put up in the backyard. And as my dad was very willingly helping me with that, it was a reality check for me. And it really made me think to myself, my dad is never going to say no to his little girl. And I need to begin to understand the limitations and the changes. I need to have realistic expectations about what I could ask my dad. So again, there's those expectations around physical abilities. The cognitive abilities, again, we can, I'll get more to that on a different slide. But we all know that our expectations related to how a person can respond to us and engage in decision making, which are some of those hard conversations as well, right? And we also know, I was just talking with somebody before this, the presentation, about that as family members, we aren't all at the same place either in our understanding, right? So if you're the day-to-day caregiver or just the one that relates to them, to the person more routinely perhaps, or just more realistically than a sibling or an aunt or someone who just doesn't see that person's changes as much as we do. So again, that we may need to both educate ourselves on those expectations as well as those loved ones that we have. And then the last thing on this slide just really talks about that as a culture, and when I speak about that, I'm talking about a pretty standard North American culture. It is our tendency to correct rather than to preserve dignity. It is our natural instinct as a culture to try and correct someone rather than to meet them in that place that our previous speaker talked about. That, you know, whichever mom was going to show up that day, we met that, you met that mom. Whereas some people have the ingrained tendency, not only because of our culture, but also just because of the strong desire to want them to be able to do those things. We want them to be able to be that mother that we no longer are recognizing as our mother. So sometimes our expectations are tripped up because of just that strong desire. So that can all really create problems and make hard conversations. I talked about these already, the previous relationships and family roles, that matriarch or patriarch of the family and wanting so badly to have that person remain in that role, or the advice giver. Again, if that person has been the person you've always turned to for advice, as a parent, as a spouse, as a sibling, as a friend, the person you've confided in, and all of a sudden you're beginning to see these changes in them. Again, my natural instinct is to want to go back to what's been normal and what I expect of them as a person in my life in whatever role they're in. So our expectations are built around that, and that can really trip up those conversations we need to have. And finally, an expectation of being in charge of things. that person might carry the expectation that they are always going to be the ultimate decision maker. And so, again, when I talk about those physical and cognitive and other changes, it may be difficult for us to get to a place where our expectation understands that they're no longer able to perform those tasks that they used to be able to do, or that they may appear more able-bodied or more cognitively intact. So again, how do you have that conversation with your sibling who's not seeing the deficit that you see, or not seeing the just not seeing eye to eye with you on where you need to go with that conversation? So what do you do with that? We're going to talk about those things a little bit today. We need to remember that there is, we do want to continue to have our loved one with memory loss, or the person we're caring for, to continue to participate in decisions, in important decisions. as well as just day-to-day, they need to have purpose, right? So we need to find a way to include them, and knowing how to work around some of those, having some tools in our toolbox to help us do that. That's my hope today, is that we're gonna be able to learn some of those tools. There are things that I call expectation busters, which a few of them I've talked about already. The fact that dementia is a progressive degeneration, and there are people in our lives, family members, other people who see our loved one, who are the person we're caring for, who say they seem fine to me. They're not seeing what you see. And when you combine that with the fact that people with dementia have the ability often to retain a lot of strengths, which include a good social facade. Many of them can appear in a social setting they can still answer a lot of questions and participate in social conversation without a lot of trouble. And those can be expectation busters. That can set us up for an unrealistic expectation when when our loved one appears to ourselves or to someone else to really be tracking in a conversation, or to be reporting something accurately, when they really are just really good at participating in that cadence of conversation. When you think about, a lot of our social conversations are about this deep, right? When you ask someone how they are, or what they did for their day, or a person who does not know the exact answer to that question can often pull it off to somebody who's either not paying attention or didn't really care, right? So if you are paying attention, I always say, I don't want people to quiz their loved one, but at the same time, every now and then you might want to throw out a question that does have a specific answer, not to trip them up. And again, if you realize you've made somebody uncomfortable, you gracefully find a way to shift the conversation. But it can be a real eye opener when someone if you need to convince a family member, that's one way to help with that piece of the conversation, is to ask them, I know you believe that Mom understood that, but did you ask her specifically? Or when is the last time, I know that you're confident that she knows who you are, but when's the last time she called you by name? And again, that's a dicey place, because I don't ever want to have somebody quizzing their mom, and every time they go there say, you know who I am, right? What's my name? That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, at some point, especially when you're trying to help someone else have a realistic expectation, it's important to help them to see some of those, some of the social facade is a wonderful, wonderful coping mechanism, and you never want to take that away from somebody. That's a great opportunity for them to be able to still participate in life, because they can pull it all together to have a conversation that looks like they're all together. But at the same time, when you're as a family needing to make decisions and needing everybody on the same page, sometimes you need to find a way to help people have realistic expectations. I always like to start with the basics about communication when we're talking about having hard conversations, because conversations are more than words. And as caregivers and as communicators, it's important for us to remember that only 20% of our communication is the words that we say. And so whether it's a communication with the person with memory loss, or whether it's communication with the family that you're trying to work with, we need to remember that there's a whole lot more to it than just what we say. And so we need to be aware of the gestures that we make, the faces that we make, the rolling of our eyes. How many of you raised a teenager? That drove me crazy. But, we need to be aware of when we are sending a message that says that we're frustrated, or that says that we're angry. What is our face looking like? Are we making eye contact? So, and some of these are really more specific to the person with memory loss. And again, recognizing that, again, over the continuum of from mild cognitive to the end stages of dementia, it's a continuum, right? But when we need to approach people from the front, these are just the really, really basic 101. We approach from the front. Why? We don't want to surprise them. We want them to, some would say not directly from the front, because that can be kind of confrontive. That can be an aggressive sort of move. So it's, you're kind of approaching a little gently from the side, but so that they can see you, engaging them with touch often that was as mentioned earlier before, sometimes just our presence and making sure that they're aware of our presence before we really begin in a lot of verbal communication. I talk about pace a lot because our pace matters more than we know. Whether you're in a work environment or a home environment, we live in a fast-paced world, and we are often multitasking and moving around really quickly. And for a person with memory loss, that can be distressing. It sets a tone for them of just busyness, and so that might mean we don't have time for them. It might mean that there's an emergency. If you think about what that can mean to a person, whether they're at their home or whether they're in a living facility somewhere, people hurrying around can be very distressing to them. Also, just thinking about how you're presenting yourself. I talk to professionals about this a lot. I was at one of the places I was working, I was there. There were 3 separate cottages, and I would often move around from one cottage to the other, often with a notebook or something in my hand. I love visiting with folks, and I love communicating with people who are sometimes hard to communicate with. That's one of the things that give me joy in life, is to be a person who can take the time to make a connection with somebody. And so I often was doing that, but there were times when I was about business, and I'd be walking from one place to the other, and I would go through one cottage to get to the other cottage. And one day my staff stopped me and said, "Janelle, you know what, we love it when you come in to visit, but if you're not going to visit and you're just coming through, could you go around the other way?" Which offended me greatly, and also made me wonder what is going on in there that they don't want me in the cottage. And I said, "Tell me more," and they said, when you stop to visit, that's great. When you're taking the time to interact, we love that. But when you rush through, it's a disruption. It puts people on edge. They wonder who that was and why they just walked through their house. And so I just say that to both. I say that to both family members at home as well as people in a professional care setting. Our pace matters, and we need to really be mindful of that. What message am I sending? What am I communicating through my pace? It's important that we ask one question at a time and take time to listen. If we listen to ourselves sometimes when we're talking to someone who especially needs a little bit of time to respond, we pepper them. We pepper them with one question after another, or we will sometimes say it one way and then we'll say it another way, and we never allowed any time for that person to respond. And a person who, especially depending on what part of their brain is the most impacted by their dementia, those with that slow processing speed, some of them need 90 seconds to formulate a response. 90 seconds is a long time. And so I will often find, I have to sit on my hands sometimes, because I talk with my hands a lot. But sitting on my hands, if I'm in conversation with someone, reminds me that I need to shut up and listen, wait for their answer. And so it's important that we can also rephrase the question. I have it on your notes. It says to rephrase or not rephrase, because different people will tell you different answers to that question. Some will say if you ask a question and it's not answered, ask it again in the exact same way. because that gives the person time to process the words you just said. Others would say if you asked it one way and you don't get an answer, then you might want to try and ask it a different way so that they understand, so that they hear it differently. So again, a lot of these things that I say, I really believe are, I believe when we're communicating with our folks, we need to, it's a trial and error. It really is. We need to pay attention to what works. And as family caregivers, you know best what works with your loved one. And so I would encourage you, especially if you're sharing with other people who are helping you, as we've talked about the importance of, when you find those helpers, make sure that they understand the way that you have found works best for communication. I've talked about nonverbal communication. I want to talk a minute about being the helper. I believe, especially in the later stages of dementia, that our folks know at some level that they need help, and especially in the moderate to end stage of dementia. They may not want to accept help, but I believe on some level they know that they need it. So I think they're always looking for that. And so I believe it's important to look like you're available to help, be available, be near them so that they can see that they have a helper with them. And again, that's particularly important in a professional setting where they're receiving care outside of their home. I think it's important for them to know that there are people there who care for them. Which gets me a little bit to this next acronym of trust, and that really is just about, some of it I've talked about already. Our pace matters, that's the T, tempo. Relationship matters, again, starting with those short, simple social connections with people. I think when we arrive at their home or when we come into the room of our loved one, to do a task, and we do often come in to do a task, before we start doing that, it's important that we connect relationally with them. It's important that we start with that holding of the hand or that, social conversation. How are you today? How are things going? This is equally important in the family setting as it is in a professional setting. Understanding them, knowing who they are. I'm going to talk at the end about life story. Because I think one of the times when conversation is hard has to do with just what do we talk about or how do I engage them, and knowing their life story, and again as a family member, knowing the pieces of their life story that matter most to them at that time can be a huge tool in making that visit time that can often be filled with empty space. It can fill the space with things that are meaningful to both you and your loved one. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I just had someone that I work with text me about the S in this, the SAFE, because she's like, what is it you say for people who are looking for their mother or asking to go home? I have a number of things that I will talk to those folks about, but I always start with helping them to feel safe, because to me, I believe that those two things, saying I want to go home, or looking for their mother, or looking for their spouse, I believe that those are things that indicate a feeling of distress and feeling unsafe. Because if you are lost, where do you want to be? You want to be home. Whatever home means to you at that time, you want to be home. And when you are sick or not feeling good or just in distress, who do you want? You want your mother, you want your spouse, you want whoever that is your anchor. So for me, those two scripts, that I need to go, I got to get out of here, or I got to go home, or where's my mom? I have a script. I talk often. This is a different presentation that I give about creating scripts with people, especially when they're distressed. I teach a lot on difficult behaviors, but this script, you are in the right place, helping them to know that they are in the right place, that wherever they are, and people can be asking to go home when they're sitting at their own dining room table. right? Anybody can relate to that? They can be at home and asking about going home. So you're in the right place. Your family knows you're here. And if you are, if you know a name of a family member, if it's you and you're their daughter, the people who love you know that you're here. And there are people here to help you. I'm here to help you right now. How can I help? That is a script that I believe is useful both in home settings as well as in professional care settings. I use it often. I use it with people I know well. I use it with people I do not know at all. If you've ever been to a nursing home and you've seen somebody in a reclining Broda chair just calling out, I have gone up to those people, not knowing them from anyone, and saying to them, you are in the right place. Your family knows you're here, and there's people here to help you. I think you'll be amazed. From there are obviously other things that we can say when someone is looking for their mom or looking for, and that's Naomi File, Teepa Snow, both are excellent trainers. Naomi just passed away in the past year, but validation therapy was definitely a foundational training for me as I started as a social worker. And what her thing is when somebody's asking about their mom, engaging them in conversation about their mom. I never met your mom. Tell me about her. What's your favorite story about your mom? If I were to see her, what would you want me to tell her? There's lots of things that you can say that will help the person. Again, I would start with making sure they feel safe, but then I move on to those things that help them to reminisce about the person. Or home, where is your home? That's a useful question to ask. I'm not going to talk about this get in depth about this, but we listen for what I call context and present reality. We listen for what they're saying. What can I tell from what they're saying and what they're asking me about where they think they are and when they think this is? Are they asking for a loved one who is a sibling of theirs, and maybe they're asking about their sibling in a way that helps me to know that they think they're like probably in their early teens or late 20s, that are they thinking of themselves as a child? Is that where they are in that particular time? And I'll give an example. Barb was a woman who sometimes she would say, sometimes she would be asking about the farm, and she'd be worried about her girls. And so at that point, I had a script that I asked my staff to know as well that involved talking to her about her 6 children. She had 6 daughters. And so we would, talk to her about her daughters, talk to her about her husband, talk to her about her dog, talk to her about life on the farm. There were other times when Barb would come up to me and say, I need a ride home. Can I get a ride home? And we had learned enough about Barb to know that when she was growing up in a small town in southern Minnesota, she went to high school in the neighboring bigger city and stayed there in boarding school, and then later was working in the city and living again communally there, and would need a ride home. So when she was asking for a ride home, I knew that in her mind she was either in high school or her young 20s, not yet married. In dealing with some of the conversations with folks that we're caring for, our biggest goal, my biggest goal, and yours I believe as well, is to not rock their world, right? We want it to be a good day. If Barb is asking me for a ride home and thinks that she's in her early 20s and I'm either a coworker or a fellow student, and I start to talk to her about her daughter who's going to pick her up for lunch later that day as a way to calm her down, what did I just do? I rocked her world, because in her mind, she was not yet married and didn't have kids. That's what I mean about context and present reality. We listen to them to know where they think they are, who they think I am, and how old they think they are. And that helps me to identify the script that I'm going to use, if that's how I'm going to get through that particular hump. And the T on trust is at the end is time, because all of those things that I just talked about, take time. And whether, I just said, right, we live in this busy, busy world, so whether we're at home caring for someone or whether we're a professional caregiver, to take the time to know those things, to relate to people on a very personal level, takes time. But I always encourage people to think about that as an investment, because that investment in time is going to save you an escalated emotional situation. If we don't take the time to calm someone and to help them to feel comfortable and confident in that moment, then we might be able to push the problem off for a while, but eventually that behavior or that emotion is going to escalate. So we need to do that quickly. I'm going to move into what I call 8 ways to relate. And this is something that I developed when I was working with a family whose mother was living at home in, I would say, well, I'll call it moderate dementia. I mean, right, how do we decide, where those lines are pretty blurry, right? I mean, if you'd have asked her, she would have said mild. And certainly her children would not have engaged my advice if they weren't at a place where they really felt like it was time for a change. And so as we looked at that and we talked about kind of assessing how things were at home and having that difficult conversation, for that situation, the difficult conversation was how can we get help into mom's home, or is it time for mom to move, and if so, how do we have that conversation? And I like, as you saw through my trust acrostic, I like to have ways to remember things. So I came up with words that end in the 8. So 8 ways to relate, and we'll just talk briefly about those. The first one is to appreciate, also anticipate. I believe before we can begin problem solving any of those questions, about driving, about moving, about getting help in, all of those things, the first thing that we really need to do is think about the unique personality of this person. What do I know about my mom that helps me to understand and have some insight here into what we're, the question that was asked earlier about, I think it was a question from the room about the spouse who wants help, or doesn't want help, but you have to give the help. And my first answer to that would be, we really need to first of all stop and appreciate who she is, and let's look at what is there about her unique personality that is at the root of her resistance to the help and the care. So we consider their unique preferences, their personality, their values, their history. How does what I know about them affect how I will relate to them, and what can I expect from them? So if you're, in my case, my father, very much an in-charge, the in-charge dad who had all the answers and was never was not dependent on anyone for much, for most of his life, I could expect that his response to a conversation about no longer driving a car was going to be a hard one. When we know that to start out with, that can help us to understand a little bit about how we're going to proceed with the conversation. How will I use this information, this appreciation, this understanding? How will I use that to shape the conversation? And how will it impact the other stakeholders? That's another piece that we need to do on any of these things, is who are the other stakeholders? Who else can be on my team, but also who else is going to care about the decision that was just made? Who else is going to be able to help us? And that might be a doctor, that might be siblings, that might be other relatives. Sometimes, again, as I said earlier, I'm the baby in my family. So I'm not the best one to deliver that kind of conversation. It comes much better from my elder sister than it does from me, because my sister is looked at with more authority than I am in my family, and I can accept that, and I don't have to fight against that. I can just see that as a fact and say, okay, I need to be more in the background on this, simply because of my role. So we appreciate or anticipate. then we really need to evaluate and look at the situation. So with his family, really looking at, okay, what does your mom have at home? What does she, how is the house set up? What does she have for help available? Has she accepted help in the past? What is the issue? The next question is an important one, because it's who is it bothering? Whose problem is it? Because sometimes what's bothering me is not bothering my loved one in the slightest. And so knowing whose problem it is, and then being able to really look at, is it even a problem? Who owns it, and is it a problem? And sometimes the answer to that is yes, but sometimes the answer is no. If mom is not changing her clothes for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, at some point it gets to be a problem. But is it a problem today? Or is it, so you're looking at not only is it a problem, but can it be postponed? Is there, and not in a procrastinating way, but in a way that says, okay, is it a crisis right now in this moment? And does it have to be? And if I push it, will it be? So really, it's picking and choosing based on what we know, when we're gonna deal with something, who we're gonna have help us with it. Really looking at what is working, what are the resources that are around. This is evaluation is really taking a big picture look at whatever this situation is. So with my grandmother, who had dementia and was in her early 90s, still living by herself, when we began to see Post-it notes around her house, it was kind of, yeah, okay, let's pay attention. When we began to see the Post-it notes in her car about checking for gas or about, different directions, it's like, okay, that radar's up a little higher now, right? So I would say the question about driving is a huge, huge issue for most families at some point. And I wish I could tell you that there's an easy way to do it, because there's not. And sometimes doctors are helpful, sometimes they're not. Sometimes DMVs are helpful, sometimes they're not. And sometimes a person will very willingly get to the point where they understand that their driving is not safe. Sometimes they will never see that. And so there's no cookie cutter answer to that, but doing it, so I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that one. Okay, I know, if that's what we were looking for, I thought she was going to answer that. One of the questions in evaluating is who is the decision maker, and what is my level of influence? I already talked about my personal level of influence in my family, but there may be times when if you are not the decision maker and your influence is small, that you are not going to be able to influence a change. And it's just really being able to understand that. Getting the decision maker in place. Do they have power of attorney? Should it be activated? If so, who is the person given that authority? And if it's, all of those things impact this evaluating part. The next of my 8 is to communicate, really looking at who are those other stakeholders, who are the other players, who can I pull into this conversation? And I've listed a few there, your family, friends, faith community, healthcare professionals, if they're in a housing setting, the housing team. Figuring out what's the best way to communicate with the team. There's a lot of really handy technology things that help families who are in different places to create spreadsheets together, or for visiting and other communication tools. Look into those and find resources for those. That's one way to talk about how are we going to communicate as a team. Is there going to be a family meeting, and if so, will we do that in person or will we do it through Zoom, and what are our other options? And then just really talking about how do we have those hard conversations. I'm going to give a little more examples of that at the end of the conversation. But so really figuring out who you're going to communicate with, how you're going to communicate, who's on the team. The next one is motivate. Sometimes when we can't convince someone, we I have a side word for this one, and it's manipulate. But people don't like that word. Manipulate and motivate are often the same thing, and manipulate's not always a bad thing, right? But how do we use the values and preference of that person in favor of the change that we're asking for? So if it has to do with hygiene and they are highly self-conscious, and then do you use the fact that companies coming over to convince them or motivate them? What can we motivate with? If you know that you're not going to be able to, if your sphere of influence to make it happen is small, then how do we help them to decide it on their own? So how do we suggest it? So for the driving, are they someone who will respond to the motivation of the safety of others? If not themselves, can you have a conversation that involves the safety of others and that they can understand? Maybe it's money. Maybe it's the value of saving money, and you can find some way to make whatever it is you're trying to happen be based on either saving money or finding a way to again, that gets back to the very beginning, that appreciating that, knowing them, what motivates them, what are their preferences, and how can I use that to motivate? What matters most to them, and how can you leverage that to help you with whatever situation it is you're trying to accomplish at that moment? Negotiate, that's the next one. I call that let's make a deal. How can you take those hard conversations and say, okay, whatever the situation is going to be, how can you really think outside of the box and brainstorm about those possible solutions? When there is resistance, really trying to understand the reason behind it. So if the person is resisting care, again, to the earlier question, trying to really get at the bottom of what that's about. And honestly, how many of us really want to stand up really quickly to be in line for receiving help with personal cares? Anybody? Right, it's not, and none of us want that. And so to be able to, so is it a modesty issue for someone who's resisting care? Is it just a resentment that they're angry that they need the care? All of those things can be reasons why there's resistance. And so when we know the emotion or maybe the practical thing that's behind it, that can help us to have a conversation. I know this is hard. We can say, I know this is hard, and I would not want this help either. It's the power of the words "I'm sorry" is really amazing as well. To be able to say, "I'm sorry, I don't like this either." That can be a powerful way to get beyond that as well. Sometimes it's fear. Maybe so. If it's about going somewhere, if it's about moving from their home. We will often find that the reason that they won't move is because of a pet. They have a pet, and they know that the place that someone's trying to get them to go won't allow the pet. So again, that's another hard conversation. And at what point, I think one of the things we need to think about when we have an idea of what needs to happen, one of the things that we need to think about is the difference between health and safety and well-being, because there's a difference. And we're a very paternalistic society. We're a very paternalistic healthcare system, for sure. And so often what we think of as health and safety and this person's need to be somewhere where they can have more help and more care, we will think that's more important than being at home with the German Shepherd. But if we're really looking at that person's well-being, the German Shepherd probably wins. So really thinking about that even as we're trying to negotiate through those things. The next one is accommodating. Sometimes we can just figure out, okay, what is a workaround? What can we do if we can't make this happen? What Band-Aid can we put on it? What workaround can we do? So maybe, in my my own family, my mother still has her car and she still drives, but she really hasn't driven in a very long time, because anytime there's something that involves going somewhere, one of her girls offers to drive. And she, at this point, I think somewhere in her mind knows she probably shouldn't, and she always accepts it. So I think the car may remain in the garage and the driver's license in her wallet for a really long time, but our accommodation is simply to always make it an outing, make it something that we do with her instead of her driving. And so that's an example of an accommodation or a workaround, and I'm sure you probably could give several examples as well. We facilitate or coordinate. We really look at what you can do to make it happen. So with this family that was trying to decide if mom could continue to live at home, some of what they started to do, meals were an issue, nutrition, which it often is, especially for someone living alone. And they had tried several things. When we looked at the evaluation, what had worked, what hadn't worked. She really didn't want Meals on Wheels or that sort of thing, and they had tried other frozen meal options. That really wasn't working. So they facilitated other, again, as family, bringing meals over, and that was more acceptable to her, and they were able to do that. So they delegated some tasks as stakeholders, and they made it happen that way by coordinating it. And I think on this one I have, sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So instead of saying, Mom, is it okay if I bring over some meals, you show up with some meals. And then, if you have to apologize, you apologize, but it's often the help that won't be accepted with an ask will often be accepted when it's in front of them. So sometimes we just facilitate or coordinate. The last one of my 8 is mandate, because at some point, the bottom line has to come down to, this might sound contradictory because I just said sometimes well-being trumps over health and safety, but there is a time when safety, when it's no longer a choice, when there's something happening in the environment that mandates that change. And that's when we really have to look at how do we need to make this happen, and how do we implement those steps? And that might need in activating a healthcare directive or seeking a guardianship or some, at this point it can be some pretty difficult and in many ways things to do. And that's why, again, doing anything on those negotiating and the steps that I talked about ahead of time are certainly preferable to this one. And sometimes, but sometimes it really does get to a situation where we need help beyond ourselves. Sometimes adult protection might need to be called in, or we need to really bring in the big guns, whatever those big guns are going to be. If there's really truly a situation that is truly unsafe in a way that jeopardizes probably more than them, or you're having an eviction, whatever's happening that it really has to move forward and they're digging in their heels, that's when you really have to probably look at some more serious things. So just to summarize, really in those steps to problem solving, we want to identify the issue and then really identify the issue. Often we think we know the issue, but it's not until we dig deeper and really look at the underlying reasons or emotions or other things that are at the root of the issue to really know. And then, again, part of that is also about the urgency. How important is this? Is this a problem that needs a solution today? Or is this a problem that we can, as a stakeholder group, whether it's family or others, do some creative thinking around? And then again, what is your realistic ability to affect a change? You may not be the decision maker, and this may not ever be your decision to make. If someone else is in that position of authority, and again, there are legal ways that you can try and make changes happen if you need to, but the bottom line is there may be times when when your realistic ability to affect a change is not going to cut it. I said I would talk a little bit about use of life story, and I think, again, one of the things about hard conversations is I often have people say, I just don't know what to visit about. I don't know what to talk about with my loved one. It's really hard. There's just stress, or there's empty space, and I don't, conversations are hard. Their train of thought is short, and we can't finish a conversation. And that's when I really bring out the use of life story as a tool in your toolbox that, if you're not using, I would encourage you to use for a number of reasons. Ted talked about when people ask him to tell his wife stories. Tell me about her. I encourage you to do that now. Start telling those stories now. We don't have to wait until our loved one is no longer here to really think about what are the stories. And I like to think of it this way. If you have a grandchild in the future who has never known this person, who's born years after this person passes away, what are the things that you want them to know about this person? What are their stories? And, we all live our lives through our stories. They matter. They are our identity. And we often know which stories matter most to the person with memory loss in our life because they're the stories they tell over and over and over again. I always say we need to look for what matters most, and we can get our cues for what matters most in part by the conversations that they're having. But we really want to preserve those memories because they are our legacy. They are the legacy that person leaves behind. And so not only is it a great tool for you right now, but it is the legacy that grandchild that never met that grandparent, or whoever it is in the future that you want to know something about this person. It's their stories that you're going to tell them to help them know that. So using those stories can de-escalate someone. It can really help us to make those visits meaningful, to provide care, and to de-escalate hard moments. So we use those to remember who they are, to keep finding moments of joy and celebrating those, and also those stories can also help us just to gain new information too. It's amazing when you start reminiscing with someone, you might gather information that you never knew before. So the use of story is really, really important. I do want to, and this is, we've got, I think, a little less than 10 minutes before we start questions, but I want to just talk a little bit about a different kind of hard conversations because, these aren't in your notes, it was conversations about disease progression and goals of care. I think we don't talk about those things enough, and those are definitely hard conversations that as a culture we also tend to avoid about every kind of healthcare decision, about just what matters most and how we want to live our lives and all those things that are important. So Stratus Health has a tool that gives a list of 7 things for healthcare professionals to think about, which I think also apply to families as well. And the first is just starting with the people around the table. So if your loved one has a diagnosis, obviously, of dementia, obviously having conversations about goals and what matters most early so that they can be a part of this discussion is the most ideal, right? We want that person's input in what they would want and what matters and what kind of treatments they would want, what kind of treatments they wouldn't want, all of those things. So we start with talking about what they know, what we know as a person, as a family. What do we know about what we're facing? Well, actually, I'll back up. First, we need to have these conversations in the right place at the right time with the right people. That's first. First, we need to pick and choose the timing of our conversation well. We need to make sure that it's at a time when emotions are not high about something else, it's best to have these conversations not in a time of crisis, but at a time when people are in a state of mind where it's a bit easier to have those conversations. So right place, right time, right people at the table. And then we start with what we know. And moving from there to what are our expectations and hopes? What would we really like to see? And from there, kind of narrowing those hopes and dreams to what are our realistic expectations? I was dealing with a patient recently. I mentioned that I work in hospice. So again, this is not a dementia situation, but it definitely is a situation with this healthcare conversation and what are we doing right now. They, as a family, the mother and daughter had talked about a trip to France. And it got to a point where that had not happened, and at this point, as she's entering hospice, probably not able to happen. So that was the hope, that was the hope and dream, but they needed to, in that conversation, shift it to something, to a more realistic. So they planned a different kind of trip to do, so they still went somewhere, but they didn't go out of the country, and they made it a realistic thing for mom to be able to do at the place that she was at in her diagnosis. The same, we talked about air travel earlier with, if there's, what are your hopes of things you want to do, and if that includes travel, we know we should do that early, and we know that we should plan accordingly. So again, it's just being realistic about, we have these hopes and dreams, all of those things that, again, we talked about with Dr. Bowman, but we want to, then we bring it into realistically what can we expect. We do that with empathy for everybody around the table, everybody that we're talking with. We make sure that we're being empathetic with each other, and then we make a plan. And then the seventh step of that list is to review it and revise it as needed. So when we have those conversations early, we set a course as much as we can with the input of the person we're caring for, and then and the other stakeholders. But we revisit and revise as much as we have to, or when we have to. I think it's important, there's a couple of different resources out there. One is the book Being Mortal, which just helps us to really focus on what is important to you as an individual, to you as a family when you're faced with a diagnosis that is a surprise and that is life-altering. What is most important and what matters? And then there's another concept that's called ethical wills. And for that one, all I'll say is that it's really thinking about that legacy that we leave. And an ethical will really looks at more than just the things that we leave in wills tend to be physical things, right? Money, other things like that. An ethical will is a passing on of our values and a passing on of the things that matter most and those less tangible items that we want to pass on. And so you can, there's a book out there on ethical wills written by Dr. Barry Baines. There used to be a website. I'm not sure if that website is still functional or not, but thinking about that and that having those sorts of conversations bring up, they're a great place to start having some of those other hard conversations. So with that, I think I'm 2 minutes before my end time, but we will go to questions if you have any.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Another great way to end the day. We do have some questions, and let me pull them up. The first one is, my family is reactionary and I'm a planner. How can I communicate with them better so that they understand I'm planning for the future, as they aren't ready to hear about that?
Yeah.
And I know it's coming.
If I'm understanding the question, what do you do when you're the planner who wants a roadmap and the rest of the family isn't there? Is
right.
that kind of the gist of it?
She knows what's coming up, and they kind of have a blind eye to it. Yeah.
So that gets to the, well, first of all, I think it's important to communicate what we need, right? And so if we're talking to our family and we're the planner, I think it's important to say, as we sit down together, this would be helpful for me. I would like to have as much of a plan as we can. Listen to them, find out the why that they don't want to go down that path. Because maybe, I think that's an important piece, is that when we make assumptions, when we are not in harmony, I'll just put it that way, when we're not in harmony with other people who are stakeholders, we might make an assumption about why they're doing something or not doing something. And it's important that we ask. It's important that we say, you know what, here's what it seemed to me. It seems to me like you don't have any idea what's going on with Mom, and you're in denial, and you don't want to make this plan because you just don't get it. You might want to be that blunt. You might want to be a little kinder with that. You might want to say, help me understand. I like that. Those words are really important words. Help me understand. I really feel like a plan would be helpful, but I can see you're resistant to it, and please help me understand why you don't think we should do that, or help me understand what's keeping you from wanting to do that. And then that can help you truly to understand where you're at. Is there resistance the reason you thought it was, or is there resistance something completely different? Because that might realign your own thinking. But then what are their expectations? Getting back to the very beginning of this talk, helping them to realign their expectations, giving them perhaps the concrete information that they need to catch them up if they're behind. And it could just be that, we also all know that the best laid plans in this disease process might go to plan, and it might not, right? So making sure that your own understanding and your own expectations are realistic as well, and then hoping to find that middle ground. I mean, and sometimes families can find it and sometimes they can't. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I think, too, some families just aren't ready to talk about those things because, like we talked about with grief, it's not something that we're real comfortable talking about, and that's like one step closer, and I don't know if I want to go down that road yet. And sometimes it's just like that's not what I want, and I don't want to talk about it because I'm not going to agree with it, and so you don't want to get in arguments with your siblings, and so then it's just, there's so many different reasons. So I think what you said, particularly about finding why, asking the why question, because we do tend to just react and we want this. The next is a comment. I think everyone will appreciate. I asked my husband about his service. He told me he wanted Pharrell's song "Happy" performed. So it's just like a real happy song, thus the name. And she said, I wrote it down, but told him no way. In the end, I honored his wishes. The song was performed as an instrumental duet, piano and violin. It was the most memorable part of his service. There was not a dry eye in the group. Mm-hmm. So, like, as you were saying, to honor people's wishes and really find out what they are, it's important.
Yeah.
And then another question is about just that balance of risk. It seems like it's always like risk versus quality of life, and you end up on this, like, where do you go? And you spoke to it a bit, and I didn't know if you wanted to expand a little bit more with some extra time about just how that balance is of protecting someone maybe at all costs versus letting them have the things that they enjoy that may put them at more of a risk, or maybe something that you don't necessarily agree with.
Right. I think a question that I encourage people ask, and I ask myself when I'm, as a social worker, working with somebody who's at home, that perhaps the rest of my team, as a social worker, it's my job to kind of help people advocate for their rights, right? Advocate for what they want. So a question that I ask myself often and encourage families to ask is, what is the worst thing that can happen if we don't make this change that we want to? What is the worst thing that can happen? And I think that's where the goals of care question is so important, to have had that as early as you can, or to be creating goals of care around what you know about that person. the person who has the pet that is their world is there. I mean, what if her goal is to be at home with that animal as long as she can? Figuring out, first going through what are the things that we can do on that list? What are the accommodations we can make? What are the things that we can do to lessen the risk? What are the things we can do? And then really always going back to that goal of care question and what's the worst that can happen, and knowing that, I'm going to say something that it's just the truth. There are worse things than death. And for some people, living at home with that animal and if that means that, again, you try to put everything in place that you can. What are our fears? What do we think could happen? They could fall down and not be able to get up. They could, they could not get up in the morning, and so my things are, what can we do? What is there technology we can put in? Really thinking outside the box. What can we do to accommodate this person's wishes as best as we can to mitigate that risk? And then how can we list out what are the worst case scenarios, and if we can live with those, if the family can live with those, and they're really acceptable by community standards of care for people, then as hard as it might be, we allow the situation that we don't like to happen as long as until a change can happen or until the end comes. So some people don't like that answer, but to me it really does depend on. There's so many factors, so it's hard to generalize that question because there's so much that goes into that. I just think we need to be careful when we're thinking about it. We need to understand our tendency to put health and safety ahead of well-being and really make sure that we're thinking about both of them when we make decisions.
Good answer, yeah.
I'm an animal person, so
Yes.
I want to be with my dogs.
And we do have an in-person question here.
Yeah, one question for you. My wife has Alzheimer's and sometimes says things that are quite funny. I wanted to ask you about the role of humor in communication, maybe both sides of the coin relative to that.
Yeah. Humor is one of the best tools that we have. Again, we have to know our audience, right? We have to know the personality of the person we're working with. And some people are going to say, is she meaning to be funny, or is she just saying it and it will be embarrassing to her? So really it gets back to the very beginning, appreciating and knowing that person and knowing their sense of humor and knowing how that works for them, and will that lighten the moment or will it embarrass them and make it difficult? So again, no cookie cutter answer, but I tend to lean towards using humor and starting there until I know with that person that it's not effective, because it can really shift the atmosphere from tension to a situation that is funny for everybody and that lightens the day. So I say use humor whenever you can, but be aware that it does have a tendency. It can. The flip side of that coin is they might not find it so funny, and that could make them angry or embarrassed when we try to when we point out the humorousness. So it's knowing them well enough to know when it's a moment we can use humor and when we can't. Yeah.
While we wait for the mic to be passed, I have another question here. Is there a book or a resource for Hospice 101?
For Hospice 101?
Yep.
Yeah. There are books out there. I don't have that information with me, but if I know who that is, if we can get a contact information, or if that person wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to get that information to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And a comment received as well. While not a hospice book, it was recommended to share the children's book, The Remember Balloons. They say it's great for kids and adults to understand the importance of life stories with dementia. And just wanted to share that with everyone.
Thank you. What was the name of the book again?
The Remember Balloons.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. I had a friend whose grandmother had dementia, and she went to go visit her in the nursing home. And she goes, "Grandma, do you know who I am?" And she looks at her and goes, "No, but you know who you are."
That's good. I think that might be all of our questions. Yeah,
Okay.
we're-
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.